a train driver is paid, on average, median salary, £59,000, a nurse, £31,000, a care worker, £21,000.
Just to come back in, Mr. Shapps, because you are picking just the train drivers here. We know that these strikes are not just train drivers, is it? There's a lot more people on much lower salaries than that working on the railways, aren't there, to be fair?
Right, but the overall median pay is £44,000. So this is not a badly paid industry.
That was Transport Secretary Grant Shapps, who is, in one sense, correct. The median wage of rail workers is £44,000. For RMT members, though, it's much lower, at £31,000. That's because they have fewer managers and drivers as members. Either way, and this should be obvious, poor pay in other sectors is not the fault of rail workers. It's just not. And using nurses as an example of why rail workers shouldn't get paid more is particularly grotesque. Of course, nurses are criminally underpaid, but the only people to blame for that are the Tories, who since 2010 have cut nurses' pay by a whopping 7%. Shapps' other strategy has been to try to divide workers from their union.
I don't think there's any need for broader, more widespread strikes. I don't think there's any need for these strikes at all. And I appeal directly to people working for the railways. You are being led down a cul-de-sac by the union leadership, telling you that there's no pay rise when there is, trying to create some sort of class war when there's none to be had. We want people to be paid more. We want sensible reforms and modernisation of our railways so we can run it for the passengers.
If Grant Shapps was really interested in making the railways run for passengers, maybe he'd bring them into public ownership like they are in most of Europe. But the nub of his point is a claim that union bosses are misleading their workers. Now, it's important to note here, RMT members voted by a whopping 89% to go on strike, and that was on a massive 71% turnout. So the RMT's elected leadership would have had to have duped a hell of a lot of people if this was really a case of trickery from above. And an interview with one of Shapps' colleagues the following day showed once and for all that that wasn't the case. You'll remember, in that interview, Shapps assured rail workers they were in line for a pay rise. But this was Simon Clarke, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, just 24 hours later.
So it's the right idea then for effectively rail workers to suffer a pay cut?
Well, in the current situation with inflation, which is a real issue, we do have to be very, very sensitive that if we start having pay awards which take us close to double digits, then we are going to see this problem prolonged, and that is just the economic reality of where we find ourselves at the moment. And
so is that a yes then?
Well, I'm not. As I say, I'm not the legal employer in this dispute, and so I'm not going to substitute myself for Network Rail or for the train operating companies. But we do absolutely need to have an understanding across the wider public sector that we cannot have inflation-busting pay increases, because that will in turn drive the problem we're trying to solve.
So, Transport Secretary Grant Shapps said rail workers were in line for a pay rise. Their union bosses were lying to them. But his colleague at the Treasury says that in fact rail workers should accept a pay cut. The implication of that statement for us all was made even more explicit in an interview Simon Clarke did with Radio 4.
The wider point here is pay discipline is going to be vitally important across the public sector if we are to avoid inflation becoming both more serious and of longer duration than it needs to be. Inflation destroys savings, destroys growth, destroys living standards. We are working very hard for our part to make sure that we manage that problem sensibly, and this is a part of that discussion.
Is it unreasonable then to want a pay rise in line with inflation?
In the current landscape of inflation at 9, bordering 10%, it is not a sustainable expectation that inflation can be matched in pay offers. That is not something that's going to be seen across, frankly, the private sector as well as the public sector. We cannot get into a world where we are chasing inflation expectations in that way, because that is the surest way I can think of to bake in a repeat of the 1970s, which this government is determined to prevent.
So to prevent further inflation, all workers should accept a real terms pay cut. That really is the line the government are going with, a pay cut for all. And don't be bamboozled by Simon Clarke's language. There is no technocratic argument that workers should accept pay cuts or else runaway inflation is inevitable. The most obvious way we can see this is that inflation is already sky high, but wages are in real terms falling by 1.2%. That's according to the Office for National Statistics. And the other clue that Clark's demands are about class war, not sound economic management, is that he hasn't asked for restraint from anyone else. Like landlords, for example. In May this year, landlords were charging 10.6% more in rent than they were a year earlier. In London, it's 15.7%. In the southwest, it's 11.5%. Now, those look like inflation-busting increases to me. So why hasn't Simon Clark asked landlords for pay restraint? Now, it goes without saying, workers would maybe be less keen for a pay rise if we weren't having to suffer 15% increases to our rent. Why aren't we talking about a rent price spiral instead of just a wage price spiral? Is it because this is more about class war than about sound economic management? The same can also be said about profits. In the first 3 months of this year, profits for UK firms were 8% higher than they were a year earlier. And for the biggest firms, it's even more dramatic. A new report from the IPPR and Commonwealth finds that the profits of Britain's largest non-financial companies were up 34% at the end of 2021 compared to pre-pandemic levels. They say that's rising significantly faster than inflation and wage growth. Unite the Union have also released a report stating that UK-wide company profits jumped 11.74% in the 6 months from October 2021 to March 2022. That's according to the most recent ONS data. In the same period, labour income only rose 2.6% and fell by 0.8% after accounting for inflation. This recent profit jump is responsible for 58.7% of inflation in the last half year, as opposed to just 8.3% due to labour costs. So, as you can see there, we have a situation where it is profits that is driving inflation, but you never ever see a minister on television saying what we think companies should do is they should hold down prices, even if that means they have to take smaller profits, because that's what you have to do to stop an inflationary spiral. They don't say, they should have profit restraint. They should say, we don't need to rise our prices. We'll take the hit. We'll keep our prices low. They never say that. These profits, this is just seen as natural, God-given. Of course they will increase their profits. Of course they will increase their prices if they can. It's going to be workers who have to take the hit. We're told we can't have pay rises because that would lead to inflation. It's never, ever demanded of landlords, never, ever demanded of bosses.
I think it helps to probe those analogies we're seeing now with the 1970s, because there's one crucial difference between our moment and the 70s. The 1970s crisis came after 3 decades of falling inequality and rising workers' power, rising unionization, for example, which led to a wage price spiral, as Tories are fond of pointing out. Well, now inflation comes after 5 decades of growing inequality and huge concentrations of wealth that ballooned through the pandemic for suppliers. And now price rises, caused in part by inter-imperialist conflict in Eastern Europe, are a new bonanza for energy firms. So we've got record wealth, record profits, Victorian levels of poverty as children skip meals for lack of money. And here is the class politics of inflation. Inflation is caused not by rising wages, but by rising energy prices, which then have a spin-off because lots of goods that we consume require oil to manufacture them. So lots of prices rise. So you've got a choice. Do you watch those prices rise? Do you watch energy bosses plan luxury holidays abroad as they rub their hands with joy? There's a lower supply of energy. They're able to sell it at higher prices in Britain, even though we don't get our energy from Russia. Do you allow them, those few people at the top, to pocket big extra profits and then say, oh dear, this is causing inflation? We'll tell workers they must fight inflation by falling living standards, including cutting 20 quid off universal credit so that some of the very poorest people in our society really can't afford to keep their homes and eat as well. If you do that, you can't claim it's just a technocratic fix. It is a class politics. Or do you control prices? Do you ban price rises beyond a certain point? Do you raise pay and benefits where prices do rise? And do you take demand out of the economy to deflate at the top with an excess profits tax, with rent controls, and with nationalizations to control prices and enable a green transition in the energy industry. It's a very clear and simple choice. Even Emmanuel Macron in France, rightly battered now with support for the left against his plans to punish older people by making their pension age rise. Even Emmanuel Macron, that neoliberal centrist politician, has a nationalized energy firm, which means that energy price rises in France are about 8%. In Britain, they're about 50%. So there are simple, clear things you can do, but it's a political choice. Having said it's different from the 70s, there's also one key respect, I think, which we should be aware, and it's too little discussed in the mainstream media, in which this is very similar to the 1970s, which is the big economic crises of the 70s were actually sparked by an energy price shock caused by a crisis at the level of politics, the level of imperialism, Arab states wanting to boycott Western allies of the State of Israel. Now, of course, again, economic crises and geopolitical crises are utterly entangled. The energy price shocks that we face are heavily caused by Russia's war on Ukraine, Russia's criminal war on Ukraine, and Western sanctions against Russia. So you can't talk about the economic crisis without also talking about the geopolitics. You can't talk about a world which is increasingly fragmenting into inter-imperialist blocs, into rivalries between the United States and Russia and China. You can't avoid talking about that if you want to talk about the economic dislocations that are caused by that rivalry. So we need a politics capable of fusing a class politics here at home that wants to save working people from the great shocks of these economic calamities with an anti-imperialist politics that wants to ask questions about the descent of the world into rival blocs. We also need information. It's really great that you're talking here about surveys done by Unite, by the IPPR, by Commonwealth. I've just seen last week that Sharon Graham, the General Secretary of Unite, is going to be funding PhDs in economics for the Unite Trade Union. In this world in which our political questions are increasingly complex and technical, we need historians, I hope. I hope I can be useful there. We need economists. We need people making the arguments for our side and revealing the deceptions and the manipulations that the other side, who control most of our press, prosecute every day.
You forgot to mention people that host YouTube shows, Barnaby. I feel very left out. We will move on, though. You mentioned the concentration of wealth at the top over the coronavirus pandemic. It's important to stay with that because, and this is especially a bigger talking point in the US, but you will hear a lot of people, even in this country, blame inflation on spending during the COVID crisis. They'll say ordinary people were just given too much money. To be clear, that's also complete bullshit, according to a 2021 article in the Financial Times. As the coronavirus spread, central banks injected $9 trillion into economies worldwide, aiming to keep the world economy afloat. Much of that stimulus has gone into financial markets and from there into the net worth of the ultra-rich. The total wealth of billionaires worldwide rose by $5 trillion to $13 trillion in 12 months, the most dramatic surge ever registered on the annual billionaire list compiled by Forbes magazine. In relation to that US context and the connection between this corporate giveaway and inflation, Crystal Ball made this excellent point.
Part of this inflationary problem is because we put too much money into the economy. There's way too much government spending, and that's why we have inflation. So that's a large part of that. It's just basic economics.
And that is not basic economics. We had this thing called a pandemic. We had a supply chain crisis. And by the way, there's a war in Ukraine.
It played a role. It's played a role.
So to act like the only reason we have problems now is because people got a little bit of money in their bank account is just not honest.
And a little bit of money, they got more than we spent in World War II. So don't act like
hold on.
Whoa.
Hold on.
Don't act like, you said don't act. Don't act like we had to react to the pandemic exactly the way we did. We had to spend $6 trillion.
Okay, but how about the trillions that the Federal Reserve shot at Wall Street? For some reason, people don't get upset about that.
How much? What'd you say?
Fueled the trillions of dollars the Federal Reserve shot at Wall Street to backstop the stock market and the bond market. No one gets upset about that, even though that was a massive
I don't know what you're talking about. What do you mean shot at Wall Street?
Well,
when are we talking about?
We're talking about buying assets, buying stocks, buying bonds, buying treasury bills so that they expand the balance sheet. This is during the crisis, the coronavirus crisis. When the stock market crashed, that is what the Fed did. They went into action. They shot trillions of dollars.
But the stock market didn't crash during COVID.
Now it's crashing. It's crashing now.
It crashed, and the Fed came in and backstopped it. That's what happened.
What, it crashed and we never heard about it?
No, it crashed. Go back and look at it.
I think
it fell off a cliff.
When?
The Treasury bond market stopped functioning, and the Fed took extraordinary action it's never taken in history.
I don't
somehow
remember
no one
that.
gets upset.
The first week of the
somehow nobody gets upset about the rich people who got tons of money and tons of support, way more than working class people did. But oh my God, people were able to feed their kids and they had a little bit of money in their bank accounts. It was the worst thing in the world. That is one small part of the inflation story. And it is, by the way, not the only thing that we can deal with to get out of this mess.
So good. So well put. And I should say, we don't normally wade too deeply into US debates, but I thought that was worth showing just because we are seeing the same debate everywhere, the same arguments everywhere. The reality, the rich got richer over the pandemic. That fueled asset price spirals, which along with a war in Ukraine fueled inflation. Yet it's ordinary workers who are blamed and who are expected to pay for the crisis. We've seen this before. It's the same script over again. For me, the most stunning bit of that exchange was the fact that Bill Maher had just completely forgotten that there was a crisis in the stock market at the start of the coronavirus pandemic and that government did step in. There was a massive bailout from the Fed, just as there was in this country. Do you think his ignorance there is also representative of the media here and the media conversation we have in this country?
Yes, it's an extraordinary revelation, isn't it? About, not that it's that surprising, about the different levels of focus that are targeted on the actions of the rich and the actions of the poor. You know, we had a whole TV series in Britain screened in prime time on Channel 4 a few years ago, dedicated to the constant monitoring of the lives of some of the poorest people on benefits and investigating whether they could be seen as feckless and were wasting their money. We've never had a series delving in documentary style to the lives of the super wealthy in order to show them as feckless and corrupt and defending their wealth and power by dodgy means that impoverish everyone else. We've never had a fly on the wall camera in their homes because they wouldn't allow it. And so we have a media that constructs a political sphere, not entirely of its own accord, but in coordination, not always open and deliberate, but in practical coordination with politicians. We have a media class that constructs our gaze to look at the actions of the poor and not the wealthy. Bill Maher doesn't even know all the ways in which the American state has defended the wealthy. And these things are both covert and overt, right? So you have the contracts being handed out in the pandemic in Britain to a mate of the health secretary, even though this person had absolutely no experience making personal protective equipment, but was given millions of pounds, tens of millions of pounds of government money because he was a friend of the health secretary. That's just sheer corruption. But you also have bank bailouts where senior bankers drive the economy into ruin. Lots of people lose their jobs. And some of those senior bankers keep their jobs and keep their massive benefits. Or Philip Green, who drives his company to ruin and keeps his luxury yacht while his workers lose their pensions. That's all perfect. And it's not called corruption because it's just integral to what a class society, what capitalism is. Tax evasion is illegal, but if you do tax avoidance, minimizing your tax liabilities, that's perfectly legal if you call yourself a company or stash your wealth overseas like the Chancellor's wife. But of course, the line between what's illegal and what's legal is all a political decision. So the free market is just not a very good framework for understanding our world. The very language of the free market is itself ideological. It's better to think in terms of class power. In the name of free market incentives, they demolish any structures of the state that redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor, whether that's the NHS or youth clubs or council housing or legal aid. And then they use the state to protect themselves, the wealthy, policing working class communities to discipline them, harassing the people they bomb and impoverish if those people try to run across borders to safety, passing laws to stop people under attack from protesting freely now and to stop workers from striking. When railway workers go on strike in Britain now, we see government ministers talk about changing the law again after they passed a high threshold for strike action to basically ban them from striking with minimum staffing levels. So the state is a contested tool, but all of this is the use of state power to enrich the wealthy while launching moral panics to divide the poor. So don't think in terms of free markets versus state intervention on the left. Think in terms of who uses the state and to whose ends. Because right now we have a kind of oligarchic capitalism where franchising on the railways broke down in the pandemic because people weren't traveling as much by railway. So government stepped in with contracts that meant companies, rail companies, still got paid by the state, whether they ran services or not, with £500 million in profits for railway companies during a pandemic when people weren't using the railways. That's not free market. That's an oligarchic capitalism.
All of us here at Novara Media are working harder than ever to keep scrutinising establishment politicians and the media barons who protect them. We don't have billionaire funders. We don't have advertising partnerships. We're funded entirely by you. If you've ever thought about supporting us, now's the time to go to novaramedia.com/support and donate anything you can from just £1 per month. Defy the corporate media. Join our monthly supporters and help build our supporter base to 10,000 strong.